So let's take a little break from JavaScript and go ahead and build out and style out our home screen, which will give the user the ability to enter a room ID or a room name and their name as well. And that will of course be put into our store, which we can then use when people start to join. So the first thing that I'm going to do is rename this component over to home rather than hello world. That makes sense. And we will see an error here because of course over in our router we're importing hello world when we should be importing home now. And of course this will go ahead and be called home and this will be called home. So that should work now and we should see exactly the same thing, and we do. Perfect. Okay, so if we come over to our home component here, at the moment we have quite a few styles in here, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these just for now. We can also get rid of our map getters in here as well and our computed properties, since we're not going to need these. We can switch the name over of the component as well, and we can actually also get rid of this data, so we're pretty much clearing this whole thing out. Now the wrapper for this is going to have a div with a class of home, and inside of here we are going to first of all start by building out the markup. Now this is just going to be a really simple form, and we're going to have an action in here of hash, and we're going to have a class in here of join, and this will submit that form and go ahead and forward us over to the room after we've set everything up with our store. Okay, so inside of here, we're going to have an H1 and we'll just say start chatting, something like that. And now will be all of our form information. So we'll start off with a label for the room and we'll give this a class of label as well so we can start this up. This is going to be the room ID, which later we're going to be generating a unique UUID, which just gives a little bit more protection rather than having a password in there. So the next thing is going to be an input with the type of text. We're going to have a name of room. Of course, that hooks up to the label. We'll give a placeholder in here as well, so e.g. ABC, say whatever pretty much, and I think that should be just about it. Let's also give this a class of input so we can start that up as well. So if we just copy and paste this down, that is going to be down here our name. So let's go ahead and say your name, and this will be class for label for name. That will be the user's name, and we can get rid of the placeholder. In this case it doesn't really matter too much. So the next one is going to be a button down here with a type of submit, and we'll give this a class as well of button and button primary, and we'll see that in a moment when we start to look at our styles, and we'll just have the text join inside of there. So at the moment it doesn't look great, of course, but that is what our styles are for, so we can go ahead and start to style this up. Now we're not going to be styling this up inside of the component, although as you saw earlier we did have a style tag in here. We're actually going to be including a styles folder inside of assets. So let's go and create a styles folder inside of here, and let's start to build up our app.scss file, which will be responsible for pulling all of our components together within Sass, as well as setting anything else that we need to. So let's go over to our styles directory, and inside of here create a new components directory, and inside of here I'm going to create a form.scss partial, and this will allow us to start to pull this together. Now inside of our main app.scss file, we're going to go ahead and import in the component that we've just created. So let's go ahead and import components form, like so. And then over in home or over in our main app, we can import this inside of our style tag, and that will take all of our styles and place them into our app for us. So we can do this in here or app. I'll let you decide what you prefer. In fact, let's do this in app because it's just a kind of central point for all of our styles. That makes a little bit more sense. So we're going to go ahead and import into here, and let's think about where we are here. Let's just close a few things off. We're inside of app, so we need to go into assets. We need to go into styles, and we need to pull in app, and we'll be shortening this in just a moment with an alias. Now at the moment this isn't quite going to work. You can see that we get an error here, and that's because first of all we don't have a style lang of SCSS, and second of all we don't have our Sass loader or Node Sass installed. So these are two dependencies that we're going to require to make this work. So let's do an npm install on Sass loader and also Node Sass, and we'll go ahead and save them out to our development dependencies. Wait for this to finish and that error should clear, and we should have our styles in there ready to go. Okay, so that should be working now. I'm just going to go ahead and tidy this up by referencing the root directory here with a tilde, and I'm also going to specify the extension here as well. Now we can tidy this up a little bit, and we can give an alias to our styles if you're going to be including these in lots of places. So let's just go ahead and do that now very quickly. So if we come over to build and webpack base config, what we should find down here is aliases. Now we've already used the @alias to resolve the source directory, so we can easily get to the source directory from anywhere. But what I also like to do here is go ahead and say styles like so, and say source assets and styles, and that just means we can reference our styles directory very quickly from anywhere that we are. Now because we've made this change, what we're going to need to do is just come over to here, go ahead and get rid of this and run npm run dev again, and we do have a couple of linting issues in here as well, so we'll fix them up as well. Okay, so let's come over and change this over. So all we need to do now is reference tilde and styles, and this should work in exactly the same way, and it does. Just to prove that, if we just come over to our asset styles components and form, let's just set the body background color within here just to make sure that this is working. Let's just set that to red, and you can see that that is in fact working. Perfect. Now we don't need to do that in there, but we know it's working. Okay, so we have a couple of linting issues here, so why don't we go ahead and fix these up now. So this looks like it's within our store index. Of course, these should all be at the top. That's what it's telling us to do. Let's go ahead and do that. And it looks like we have an indentation of 4 spaces inside of here as well. And let's go ahead and fix that up as well. And we should just have a couple more in here. So room ABC over in our state. Again, this doesn't really matter too much, but it's nice to keep consistency. And the same within our getters as well. So let's go ahead and just fix these up. The reason for this is previously I didn't have editor config installed, which goes ahead and automatically within your browser sets these kind of things. So really important to keep consistency. That should be just about it. Perfect. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go and start to style up our form stuff. So I'm going to close everything else off, and let's start to create our form styles out. So for a label then, let's see what we can do with this. We're going to set a display of block, so it's the full width rather than an inline element, and we're going to set a font weight here of 600, and we're going to set the margin on the bottom to 10px, just so we get a little bit of spacing. So if we just come over, you can see that's now a block element, and we have a little bit of spacing between that and the input. Now for the input itself, let's go ahead and style these out. We're going to set a border of 1px solid, and I'm just going to pull over a color that I previously chose. It's a nice blue color, a nice gray color, sorry. And we're going to set a padding here of 15 pixels. We're going to give this a nice border radius just so it has a little bit in there and it's a little bit softer. We're going to inherit the font, really importantly, which does come with Vue by default, but you can go ahead and change the font if you want. I'm going to set the outline to none so we don't get the blue outline on the input. It's entirely optional. It does help people that are using their keyboard to navigate down the page, so I'd highly recommend leaving that in with accessibility. We're going to set a width of 100%, a margin on the bottom of 20 pixels just to space things out, and that should be just about it. So we should now have the following. It looks a little bit odd, so what we can do is apply some styles to our home page, or what we can do is apply some styles to our main app. It really doesn't matter. So let's go ahead and make this a little bit shorter by coming over to our home page, and we're going to implement our styles down here. Let's go ahead and again use Sass for this, and we're just going to say home. We're going to set a display of flex, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. We're going to set a flex direction of column, like so. Now this shouldn't have too much impact. All this means is that what we're doing is we are using the flexbox model. We're aligning them by column, which means everything's going to sit underneath each other. And we're going to go ahead and align items center. And we're going to go ahead and justify content center. Now what this will do with the align items and justify content, if you've worked with Flexbox before, it will pull everything in, but it will also center it on the page vertically as well as horizontally as well. Now with home, we're also going to give this a height of 100%. It's not going to make too much difference at the moment. If we set our overall kind of app container with a height of 100%, that will then work. Now what we also want to do in here is style up our join form. So let's come down and apply some styles to this. I'm going to set a width of 100%, but then I'm going to set a maximum width here of 400 pixels. What that will do is it will push it out as far as it will go to 400 pixels, but it means it's somewhat responsive. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's just look at the problem we've got here. You can see room ID is center aligned. That's just because over on app.view, text align is set to center. That's the reason we use the Flexbox model, so we could center everything properly. So what I'm going to do is get rid of text align center, and you'll see that that will all sit nicely now, as it should. And what I'm also going to do is set a height on our overall app to 100%. Now the reason for this is what that's going to do is when we eventually set our body and everything like that to be a height of 100%, it's going to push this because we have justify content set to center. Now if we just inspect the page, let's go over here and look at app home and the app here, you can see that the body is the issue here. So body doesn't have a height of 100%. If I were to set the height to the body to 100%, like so, in fact, we also need to apply this to the HTML element as well. You can see that that sits nicely in the center with a couple of issues here, but we'll fix them up, like the padding on the top of the page here. So what we want to do is either over in app.scss or somewhere else, we're going to reference body and HTML. And we're going to say height 100%, and we'll just come over to app.view and fix the margin on the top to 60 pixels as well. And it looks like we forgot the semicolon. Let's give that a refresh. We end up with the following. So that is nicely centered in the page, and we can move on. So let's just double check this just to make sure it doesn't matter too much, but you can see that's now pretty much centered in the page there. Okay, so the last thing is the join button, and we'll add some nice transitions onto our form as well. So let's go and style up this join button first of all. Really straightforward. We could actually do this over in a new component. I think that would make a little bit more sense. So let's say buttons.scss, and let's go ahead and include this in here as well. Buttons, because of course we are going to want to have buttons elsewhere on our app as well. And let's set up these styles for a basic button. So text align is going to be center. So we've centered align everything. I'm going to set the border to 0 because if we are working with a button element, this is not going to quite look good unless we kind of reset the border. Set a border radius of 3 pixels. Again, inherit the font inside of here. And we'll also set the font weight to 600 as well, so it's a little bit clearer. We'll go ahead and set the padding as well, so 15 pixels, 18 pixels. We'll set the width to this as 100%. Of course, that's optional. We'll set the cursor to pointer, just so we get that pointer. We'll also set the outline to none as well, like we did with our input, so we don't get that blue background. Now, this isn't going to look great at the moment. You can see it's pretty much just white in its background, and that's where our primary modifier comes in. So I'm using the BEM methodology here. All that's going to do is allow us to set the color of the text and then the background color subsequently. So let's go ahead and grab the color that I pre-chose for this course, and that should give you the following. Perfect. So if we just go and say, well, when we hover on a primary element, we want to change the background color to something slightly different. So I'm again going to grab a color I pre-chose for this, and when we hover, you can see that is working. Now, the only other issue you can see here is that the inputs are a little bit further out. The reason for this is if we just come over to app.css, what I'm going to do, and what I do for every project, is I set box sizing to border box. That will just mean that any kind of padding that we have on elements won't push outside of the widths that we've given for things. So that just doesn't overlap with our overall container. So that is pretty much it. Still looks like we have a little bit of an issue here with our scrolling. So I'm going to go ahead and fix this up first, and then we can pretty much move on. So if we just come over to here, we're going to set the padding here to 0 and the margin here to 0, and that should pretty much fix that up. There we go, we've got no scrolling. Okay, so let's add a little slight transition when we click into an element. Of course, it's not super important, but it's nice to make things look as good as possible. So what we're going to do is when we focus on an input, like so, we're just going to change around the border color. Really straightforward. So let's grab a pre-chosen color that is also being used for that button over there. Give that a refresh, and now you can see when we click in here that works. What we can also do is add the transition in here on the border color. Let's set that to say 100 milliseconds and ease in, and what we should have is a nice transition when we click inside of these. So that is our really basic form. If you didn't really want to style this up nicely, then I do apologize, but we want this to look pretty nice. So now that we've done this, we're going to go over to the next part, and when we enter a room ID and a name, we're going to use our mutations that we set up in our store to set the room name, and that will be available then through the rest of the session. So we know which room we're joining using WebRTC.